In a far, far away galaxy called the Milky Way, there was a planet called the Earth. There lived several different types of organisms called animals, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, and viruses. These 5 kingdoms of life lived harmoniously, least most of the time, and almost all living things fall into one of them. The sneaky viruses, on the other hand, stand out because, as we'll see later, they aren't technically living organisms and thus don't belong to any of the kingdoms of life. Before we dive into the specifics of each of these groups, I should mention that they are all eukaryotes, also known as animals, plants, fungi, and protists. This means they're made up of eukaryotic cells, which have certain things in common, like the fact that their DNA is in the form of chromosomes, or that their DNA is found in a nucleus. Bacteria, on the other hand, are classified as prokaryotes and are sometimes referred to as prokaryotic organisms because they lack a nucleus. Viruses aren't technically organisms, so they don't get categorized as either eukaryotic or prokaryotic, but for comparison, prokaryotic cells are between 10 and 100 times smaller than eukaryotic cells, and their DNA is just floating around inside the cell. Let's go through each of these categories one at a time, beginning with animals. You have most likely traveled extensively throughout this kingdom. Therefore, there is not much to say other than our best guess is that there are somewhere between 5 and 10 million different species of animals on Earth, including but not limited to humans, chickens, ladybugs, lionfish, and so on. But all animals share the fact that they are multicellular, heterotrophic, and that the majority of them reproduce sexually. The term multicellular simply refers to the fact that each organism is comprised of many cells as opposed to just one. For instance, scientists estimate that the average human contains between 40 and 100 trillion cells. In contrast, heterotrophs are animals that must obtain their nutrition from external sources. For instance, in order to obtain the energy we require, humans must consume either plants or other animals. Moving on to plants, this kingdom is also well known and likely contains around 300,000 species, including redwood trees, turmeric, tomato plants, and blue lilies. Plants, like animals, have many different types of cells that make up their structure. However, it's important to note that they are autotrophs, rather than heterotrophs. Rather than relying on the digestion of other organisms for sustenance, these organisms produce their own food, through photosynthesis. The next category, fungi, is more difficult to define. Some fungi, like the mushrooms you might eat, or the molds that can ruin your food, are multicellular organisms. However, some fungi, like the yeast we use in baking, are unicellular, which means that each cell is a separate organism. Although some fungi resemble plants, they cannot photosynthesize, and must instead rely on scavenging for food like animals. Consequently, despite the fact that most fungi feed on saprotrophic nutrition, they are technically classified as heterotrophs. They essentially perform digestion outside of their bodies by secreting digestive enzymes onto food, waiting for the enzymes to break down the food, and then absorbing the nutrients. Some multicellular fungi have a body called a mycelium, which is made up of many tiny branch-like structures called hyphae. To keep this in mind, just think of a mycelium as a collection of hyphae. It's also important to remember that some fungi, though uncommon, can be pathogens, which means they can spread disease to humans. Athlete's foot, for instance, is brought on by a fungus. For the sake of clarity, I'll say that protists, protista, protists, and protista all refer to the same thing. You can use whichever one you prefer. In the context of this video, however, I will refer to these organisms collectively as protists. Although almost all protists are single-celled, unicellular organisms, there is still a wide range of species. Some species, like chlorella and euglena, are similar to plant cells in that they have chloroplasts, that allow them to photosynthesize, while others, like amoeba, are more like animal cells, and must consume other organisms, to get their energy. The final point to make is that while most protists have nothing to do with humans, some do qualify as pathogens and can spread diseases. Malaria, for instance, is brought on by the Plasmodium species. Bacteria are single-celled organisms that can be found just about anywhere, including on your skin and in your intestines. Although some species of bacteria can photosynthesize, none of them have chloroplasts, and most of them feed off other organisms, either living ones like ourselves or dead ones like fallen leaves. Although some bacteria, like Salmonella, can cause food poisoning, most of them have nothing to do with humans, and many others are actually really helpful, like the bacteria in our intestines, which help us digest our food. Scientists believe that there are probably far more species of bacteria than all of the other kingdoms combined. Finally, there are viruses, which are essentially super tiny particles. It can be difficult to conceptualize how small viruses actually are, however, to give you an idea, you could fit nearly 1 million of them across the width of a single fingernail. Since they don't qualify as cells and aren't even alive, we now refer to them as particles. It's difficult to be too specific about viruses because they come in a wide variety of sizes and shapes, but in general, they consist of an outer protein coat encasing some sort of genetic material, DNA or RNA, inside. Viruses must infect other organisms, such as animals, plants, protists, fungi, or bacteria, in order to replicate. This is why we refer to them as parasites. Parasitism simply refers to the fact that their growth and reproduction are dependent on another organism, typically an animal or bacterium. Last but not least, all viruses can be considered pathogens because they always cause harm to other living organisms when they use their cells for reproduction, in contrast to the other groups we've seen so far. The influenza virus, which causes influenza, the tobacco mosaic virus, which affects tobacco and tomato plants, the human immunodeficiency virus, which can lead to AIDS, and of course COVID-19.